Across different continents, in different climates, and in cultures separated by vast stretches of time, ancient people left behind structures that still resist simple explanation. Some stand under open skies, built from blocks so large they seem impossible to move. Some were cut directly into mountains, as if stone itself had been shaped like clay. Some vanished beneath the earth, others now rest below the sea. And yet, the same question returns again and again. How were these places really made? Not in the simplified way history is often retold, not as a vague story about labor, time, and determination, but in practical terms, in physical terms, in engineering terms. How were stones weighing many tons transported across mountains? How were walls assembled with joints so precise that even now they seem unnervingly exact? How were entire underground worlds carved from rock? And why do some of these places feel less like monuments of a distant past and more like evidence of knowledge we still don't fully understand? These are not fantasy ruins. They are real places. They can be visited, walked through, measured, touched. And in many of them, the deeper you look, the stranger the story becomes. Because the mystery is not simply that ancient people built big things. It is that some of them built with a level of planning, precision, and endurance that still feels startlingly modern. This is a journey through ancient structures that seem, in some ways, thousands of years ahead of their time. High above Cusco, in the Peruvian Andes, the walls of Sacsayhuaman rise like the remains of something too massive to belong to an ordinary fortress. From a distance, the sight already looks extraordinary, but it is only when you stand beside the stones that the real shock appears. These are not uniform blocks, cut to a standard shape. They are enormous, irregular, polygonal masses, each one carved so precisely that it locks into the next like part of a giant stone puzzle. Some of these stones weigh many tons, and yet they were fitted together without mortar, with seams so tight that even a thin blade can struggle to enter between them. The result is not just beautiful, it is structurally intelligent. For centuries, the Andes have been a land of earthquakes, and while later masonry often cracked or collapsed, these ancient polygonal walls proved remarkably resilient. The stones do not behave like brittle stacked blocks. They behave like a flexible system, distributing force through their interlocking forms. That alone would make Sacsayhuaman impressive. But then comes the harder question. How were stones of this size quarried, moved, shaped, and lifted into place on steep mountain terrain? Even with teams of workers, ropes, levers, and extraordinary discipline, the scale of the operation remains staggering. To build here required more than strength. It required planning, geometry, logistics, and a deep understanding of stone. And that is what makes Sacsayhuaman feel so modern in spirit. It was not built as a crude pile of giant rocks. It was built as a system. Every edge, every angle, every contact point between stones. It is ancient construction, but it carries the logic of advanced engineering. In western India, at Ellora, stands one of the most astonishing monuments on Earth, the Kailasa Temple. At first glance, it looks like a vast temple complex, assembled stone by stone over generations. But that is not what happened here. Kailasa was carved from a single mass of rock, not built upward from the ground, but cut downward into the earth. The builders began with the mountain itself and removed immense quantities of stone until a complete architectural complex emerged from within it. Courtyards, columns, bridges, shrines, towering facades. All of it was carved from one continuous body of stone. This reverses the normal logic of monumental construction. In most great buildings, materials are brought in, shaped, and assembled. Here the challenge was almost the opposite, to know exactly what to remove and in what sequence without destroying the whole design. A mistake in ordinary masonry can sometimes be corrected. A mistake in a monolithic excavation of this scale can ruin everything. That means Kailasa demanded something extraordinary from its creators: long-term architectural vision, precise spatial planning, and the ability to think in 3 dimensions on a colossal scale. Even today, the monument feels difficult to process. It does not merely look grand, it looks improbable. Standing in its courtyard, with human figures reduced to tiny moving shapes against carved stone walls, the true scale becomes clear. This was not just devotion expressed through architecture, it was mastery expressed through subtraction. The temple is ancient, but the thinking behind it feels almost industrial in its confidence. In Japan stands a giant stone known as Ishi no Hoden, a megalith that seems to sit in quiet defiance of easy interpretation. Unlike a decorated temple or an obvious palace ruin, this object is mysterious in a more concentrated way. It is a single, enormous shaped mass suspended above water, associated with sacred space and long tradition. Its surfaces look worked, its form looks intentional, and yet its exact purpose remains uncertain. That uncertainty is part of what gives the stone its strange power. It feels less like a ruin in the usual sense and more like an unanswered question left behind in solid rock. When people stand beside it, its scale becomes immediate. When the camera moves close to its surfaces, the impression changes again. This is not just a natural boulder that happened to attract reverence. It appears altered, defined, and set apart. And once again, a familiar puzzle emerges. How was such a mass shaped? Why this form? Why here? Ancient sites do not need to be enormous cities to be haunting. Sometimes a single worked stone is enough to disturb our assumptions, because it suggests intention without explanation. And that beneath the sands of Saqqara in Egypt lies one of the most unsettling ancient places ever discovered: the Serapeum. Its corridors run underground, cut through stone, leading into chambers that hold colossal granite boxes, often referred to as sarcophagi. But even that word can feel too simple for what they are. These containers are immense, their material is hard, their surfaces, in some cases, appear astonishingly smooth and precise. Their scale is so large that standing beside them does not just communicate size, it communicates effort. Granite is not an easy material. To quarry it is difficult, to transport it is difficult, to shape it with high precision is even more difficult. And yet here, deep underground, are vast stone boxes with sharply defined geometry and enormous lids, placed in chambers carved below the earth. Whatever their function, the technical challenge was extraordinary. How were these masses transported? How were they lowered or positioned? How were the interiors worked so evenly? The Serapeum creates a powerful collision between accepted history and visual evidence. You can read explanations, you can learn the traditional interpretation, but then you stand inside the space, look at the granite, and feel the weight of the problem for yourself. This is one of the reasons ancient engineering still captivates modern audiences. Because at sites like this, the mystery is not abstract. It is physical. It is measurable. It is right in front of you. In Indonesia, Borobudur rises from the landscape like a stone mountain shaped by thought. Layer upon layer, terrace upon terrace, the monument climbs upward through reliefs, stairways, and stupas, forming not just a building, but a symbolic journey. Today it appears calm, balanced, and complete. Visitors move through it almost as pilgrims still, following paths that spiral through carved narrative panels and ascending levels of stone. But Borobudur is not only spiritually powerful, it is technically sophisticated. A monument of this scale, in a tropical environment of intense rain and erosion, does not survive by accident. Its builders had to understand load, drainage, platform design, and the long-term behavior of stone in climate. In other words, the beauty of Borobudur depends on engineering hidden beneath its serenity. This is one of the most fascinating patterns in ancient architecture. The more harmonious a structure appears, the easier it is to underestimate the complexity required to create it. Borobudur feels timeless because it was built with systems in mind, not only symbolism, not only ceremony, but the physical logic needed to endure. On the island of Gozo in Malta stand the temples of Gantija, among the oldest monumental stone structures on Earth. Their age alone is enough to command attention, but age is only part of the story. The stones are huge. The layout is deliberate. The curving walls create spaces that feel planned, not accidental. And this is where the site begins to challenge modern intuition. Because when people imagine the deep past, they often imagine simplicity, small communities, basic tools, limited organization. But Gantija suggests something else. It suggests a society capable of organizing labor, selecting and moving massive stone, and creating architecture with ceremonial intention and structural coherence. Ancient does not always mean primitive. Sometimes it means we are looking at complexity we have learned to underestimate. High in the Armenian highlands stands Karahunj, a site that at first can seem deceptively simple. A spread of ancient standing stones set across an open landscape. But the longer you look, the more unusual it becomes. These are not random rocks scattered by nature. They appear placed, aligned, and in some cases deliberately modified, suggesting that this wind-swept plateau once served a far more purposeful role. Some of the stones contain carefully carved circular holes. That detail alone is enough to transform the site from a megalithic ruin into something much more intriguing. For many researchers and visitors, those openings raise the possibility that Karahunj was connected to observation, perhaps of the horizon, the sun, the stars, or seasonal changes in the sky. Whether every theory surrounding the site is correct or not, the impression is hard to escape. This was a place where stone and landscape were brought together with intent. And that is what gives Karahunj its lasting mystery. Ancient structures do not always impress through massive walls or giant temples. Sometimes their sophistication lies in placement rather than scale, in orientation rather than decoration. A field of standing stones may seem simple compared to a carved monument, but if those stones were positioned to mark time, direction, or celestial events, then the site becomes something else entirely. It becomes a tool. Standing among these stones today, with the wind moving through the grass and the horizon stretching out in every direction, it is easy to understand why Karahunj continues to fascinate people. Deep beneath the landscape of Cappadocia lies one of the most astonishing engineering achievements of the ancient world. Derinkuyu, an underground city carved directly into stone. At first glance, it seems almost impossible. This is not a single chamber, not a tomb, and not a simple shelter. It is a multi-level subterranean world, cut downward into the earth with planning, structure, and purpose. As you move through its narrow corridors and carved rooms, the true scale of the effort begins to emerge. Every tunnel had to be excavated by hand. Every chamber had to be shaped from the living rock. Every passage had to connect to something larger. And yet Derinkuyu is not a maze of random spaces. It shows evidence of design. There are storage areas, living quarters, gathering spaces, and carefully organized routes of movement below ground. What makes the site even more impressive is the question of survival. An underground city cannot function on excavation alone. It must breathe. It must remain navigable. It must allow large numbers of people to move, live, hide, and endure beneath the surface. That is why its ventilation shafts are so remarkable. These vertical channels were not decorative features. They were essential systems, allowing air to circulate deep into the stone. Even today, standing in one of these carved chambers and looking upward, you can feel the intelligence behind the design. Derinkuyu changes the way we think about ancient architecture. Most monumental sites rise into the sky, built to be seen from a distance. This one disappears into the earth. Far out in the Pacific Ocean, on the island of Pohnpei, lie the ruins of one of the most unusual ancient sites on Earth, Nan Madol. At first glance, it does not look like a typical city at all. There are no broad plazas, no towering pyramids, no mountain fortresses. Instead, the ruins rise from a landscape of water, vegetation, and stone, forming a maze of canals, walls, and artificial islets that seem almost impossible for their setting. That is what makes Nan Madol so striking. This was not simply a settlement built on dry land. It was constructed in a coastal, water-bound environment, using massive basalt stones stacked into walls that still look formidable today. Many of these stones are long, heavy, and difficult to imagine transporting even under favorable conditions. But here, they had to be moved and positioned in a place shaped by channels, wetlands, and shifting tropical terrain. The engineering challenge is obvious the moment you see the site. How were these basalt columns brought here? How were they lifted and arranged into stable platforms and monumental walls? And why choose to build such an elaborate complex in water at all? These questions are part of what gives Nan Madol its aura. It does not just look ancient, it looks logistically improbable, and yet it exists. Even now, the geometry of the ruins is unmistakable. Stone walls rise from shallow water. Narrow channels divide one artificial islet from another. Palm trees and dense greenery surround the remains of what was once a carefully organized ceremonial and political center. This was not accidental construction. It required planning, labor, coordination, and an understanding of how to shape an environment rather than simply occupy it. Deep beneath the surface of Cappadocia lies Derinkuyu, an underground city that seems less like a refuge and more like an entire hidden world. Corridors, chambers, shafts, storage spaces, and defensive features descend into the rock, revealing a level of subterranean planning that still feels astonishing. It is one thing to build in stone. It is another to carve a habitable environment out of it, below ground, on multiple levels, with systems for movement, air, and protection. Derinkuyu changes the meaning of architecture. It is not simply a structure placed in the landscape. It is landscape transformed into structure. And that kind of thinking feels deeply advanced. High in the Peruvian Andes, Ollantaytambo stands as one of the clearest examples of how advanced Inca stone engineering could be. The site sits at an altitude of around 2,800 meters above sea level, surrounded by steep mountains, terraces, and narrow valley routes. Even before looking at the masonry itself, the location already creates a practical question. How was a construction project of this scale organized in terrain like this? The most famous part of the site is the Temple Hill, where several enormous pink granite blocks still stand in place. Some estimates suggest that the largest stones weigh around 50 to 90 tons, and they were not simply gathered from right beside the structure. The quarry area is believed to have been located across the valley, meaning these stones may have been moved over a distance of several kilometers, across uneven ground, steep slopes, and a river environment that would have made transport even more difficult. That is what makes Ollantaytambo so impressive. This was not only stone cutting, it was logistics. It was route planning, labor coordination, and large-scale movement of material under extremely difficult conditions. Even today, with machinery, moving blocks of this size through mountainous terrain would be a serious operation. Here, ancient builders did it with manpower, planning, and an extraordinary understanding of stone. Then there is the masonry itself. The fitted surfaces, the cut angles, and the scale of the unfinished-looking blocks suggest a site where construction methods can almost still be read in the stone. You can see the ambition of the project, you can see precision, and you can also see the enormous effort behind every stage of the work. And then there is Yonaguni. Beneath the waters near Japan lies one of the most debated formations in the world of ancient mysteries. At first glance, it does not look like random geology. It looks arranged. Broad, flat surfaces, stepped levels, sharp angles and edges that resemble terraces or platforms create the impression of something almost architectural. That is why Yonaguni has generated so much argument. Some researchers see it as a natural formation, shaped over time by tectonic activity, fracturing and erosion beneath the sea. Others believe that at least part of it may have been altered by human hands. And for many people, that uncertainty is exactly what makes the site so compelling. Because the resemblance is difficult to ignore. When divers move alongside these giant submerged surfaces, scale becomes part of the mystery. The monument-like forms do not just seem unusual, they seem deliberate. Long edges appear to run in straight lines. Large, flat areas look like platforms. Descending levels resemble steps. In clear water, with sunlight moving across the stone, the entire formation can feel less like a reef and more like the drowned remains of something built. Of course, appearance is not proof. Nature can produce forms that seem surprisingly geometric, especially in rock types that fracture along straight planes. But Yonaguni continues to hold attention precisely because it sits in that uncomfortable space between explanation and resemblance. It cannot be dismissed easily by the eye, even if the science remains debated. And that is why it belongs in this story. Whether Yonaguni is entirely natural, partially modified, or something still not fully understood, it reminds us of an essential truth about the ancient world. Sometimes the greatest mystery is not certainty, but suggestion. The unsettling possibility that structure may exist where we expected only stone, and that beneath the sea, some answers may remain just out of reach. Across mountains, deserts, forests, islands, and underground worlds, these ancient places continue to challenge the limits of our historical comfort. They remind us that the past was never as simple as we sometimes imagine. Ancient people were not working in a blank world of primitive ideas, moving slowly toward intelligence. In many places, they were already solving problems of weight, distance, geometry, planning, orientation, and endurance with a level of skill that still commands respect today. That is what makes these structures so powerful. Not only their age and not only their scale, but the fact that they continue to confront us with physical evidence of human ability. Stone was quarried, transported, cut, lifted, aligned, fitted, and placed with an ambition that did not belong to small thinking. Entire spaces were carved downward into the earth. Massive walls were assembled in mountain landscapes. Ceremonial complexes were raised in wetlands and coastal environments. Monuments were positioned in ways that connected architecture to sky, season, and land. And in every case, the deeper we look, the more complicated the story becomes. Some of these places are debated because of how they were built. Others are debated because of what they were for. Some challenge our understanding of ancient logistics. Others challenge our ideas about ancient observation, symbolism, or engineering. And some are mysterious, not because they are hidden, but because they stand fully visible before us and still resist a satisfying explanation. That may be the most important point of all. The mystery of the ancient world is not only in ruins, buried beneath sand, or lost beneath the sea. It is also in the structures that have survived in plain sight for centuries, visited by travelers, measured by archaeologists, photographed by tourists, and yet still capable of provoking the same question. How was this possible? How were such heavy stones moved across valleys and slopes? How were blocks shaped with such precision that their joints still seem almost impossible? How were underground chambers designed with ventilation and movement in mind? And how were ceremonial spaces aligned so carefully with light, water, horizon, and landscape that their purpose is still felt thousands of years later? These are not small questions, because they force us to see ancient people differently, not as shadows at the beginning of history, but as builders, planners, and problem solvers. As people whose knowledge was practical, disciplined, and deeply tied to the material world, they understood stone, terrain, and construction in ways that still command respect. Because the power of these structures lies not only in what we do not know, but also in what we do know. We know they are real. We know they were built by human hands. We know they required vision, labor, and planning on a remarkable scale. And we know they still have the power to make the modern world stop and look. They remind us that history is not a simple line from ignorance to progress. It is far more complex. So when we stand before these walls, chambers, temples, underground corridors, or drowned stone formations beneath the sea, we are not only looking into the past,